Sometimes the greatest strength comes from those who have already lost everything. Sometimes the most powerful weapon against darkness is a heart that refuses to surrender hope. In a winter kingdom ruled by fear, an ancient vampire lord awakens demanding a bride. The villagers send Elira, a quiet seamstress they believe will obey without question. They think her gentle nature makes her weak. But Elira has survived losing her family, her home, and her dreams. What she carries now is something far more dangerous than rebellion, unshakable compassion, and a spirit that won't break. When she arrives at his dark castle, Lord Vaelen expects a trembling victim. Instead, he meets a woman who looks into his eyes without fear. She sees not a monster, but the man he once was. What happens when someone refuses to see you as the villain of your own story? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The village of Thornwick had forgotten the warmth of spring. For 3 generations, winter had claimed the valley like a patient predator, its icy fingers reaching into every hearth, every heart, every hope that dared to bloom. Snow fell in perpetual whispers, blanketing the cobblestone streets and timber-framed houses in a silence so complete it felt sacred. Yet beneath that sacred silence lived something far less holy, a fear so ancient it had woven itself into the very fabric of daily life. Elira Thorne drew her woolen shawl tighter as she navigated the narrow alley behind the market square, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid morning air. Her fingers, despite their practiced steadiness with needle and thread, trembled slightly in the cold. At 26, she had lived through enough winters to understand that the cold was not merely weather, it was a presence, a reminder of the darkness that watched over them from the mountain fortress above. The brass bell hanging from her sewing shop's door chimed softly as she pushed inside, its tone muffled by the thick tapestries she had hung to keep the warmth from escaping. The shop was modest, cramped with bolts of fabric that caught what little light filtered through the frosted windows. Behind the wooden counter sat her most precious possession, a worn leather pouch containing silver needles and golden thread that had belonged to her mother and her mother's mother before that. The kit had survived plague, famine, and the endless winter. Like Elira herself, it endured. She settled into her chair and resumed work on a wedding dress for the baker's daughter. The ivory silk felt luxurious beneath her fingertips, a rare brightness in a world drained of color. As she worked, her mind wandered to the stories her grandmother used to tell. Tales of a time when the valley bloomed with wildflowers, when children played in summer meadows, when the mountain castle had been a place of celebration rather than shadow. The door chimed again, and Marta Whitfield shuffled in, her arthritis making each step deliberate. At 73, Marta was one of the village's memory keepers, a woman who remembered fragments of the time before the eternal winter. "Good morning, dear," Marta said, settling onto the small stool near the fire. "How are the wedding preparations coming?" "Nearly finished," Elira replied, holding up the dress to show the intricate beadwork along the bodice. "Though I sometimes wonder if we're not tempting fate, planning celebrations when the mountain grows restless." Marta's weathered hands stilled on her walking stick. "You've felt it too, then?" "The stirring." Elira nodded. For weeks, she had sensed something shifting in the supernatural atmosphere that cloaked their valley. It was like feeling distant thunder before a storm, a vibration in the bones, a whisper in the blood. She had always been sensitive to such things, a gift that had served her well in her work, but poorly in her sleep. "The elders met again last night," Marta said quietly, glancing toward the door to ensure they were alone. "Third time this month. They speak in hushed tones about old agreements, about debts coming due." The needle paused in Elira's fingers. She had heard the whispers, two fragments of conversations that ceased when she drew near, worried glances exchanged between the older villagers. There were stories, carefully not spoken aloud, about an agreement made long ago. a pact sealed in blood and sorrow that bound their village to something ancient and hungry. "The castle has been dark for so long," Elira murmured. "Sometimes I forget it's even there." "But it is there," Marta said firmly. "And he is there, sleeping, they say, but not gone, never gone. The winter is his breath upon the land, child. When he sleeps deeply, we have our small mercies, our fires burn a little warmer, our children laugh a little louder. But when he stirs—" A log shifted in the fireplace, sending sparks dancing up the chimney. Both women fell silent, as if the very mention of the castle's inhabitant had called his attention. Lord Vaelen Mortain. Even his name was spoken only in whispers, if at all. The vampire lord who had ruled over their valley for centuries, who demanded tribute and obedience, who slept for decades at a time before awakening with hungers that had to be fed. Elira's fingers found the small pendant at her throat, a crystal her grandmother had given her. It was warm against her skin, as it always was when her emotions ran deep. "Marta, what do you know about the old agreements?" The elderly woman's eyes grew distant. "I know enough to fear them. I know that every generation, when the darkness grows thick enough to choke on, someone must pay the price for our continued existence. I know that the price is always personal." Before Elira could ask what she meant, the shop door burst open with such force that the bell above it cracked against the frame. Thomas Ashford, the village's youngest council member, stumbled inside, his face pale with terror and exertion. "Elira," he gasped, struggling to catch his breath. "You must come. Now. The council. They've sent word to every household. Emergency gathering in the square." Marta struggled to her feet, leaning heavily on her walking stick. "It's begun, hasn't it? He's awakened." Thomas nodded grimly. "This morning, just after dawn." The message came on wings of shadow, written in letters that burned themselves into the council hall's stone walls. The compact must be honored. Elira felt the world tilt around her. She had always known this day might come, but knowing and experiencing were vastly different things. Her hands moved automatically, setting aside her needlework and reaching for her heavy cloak. The crystal pendant grew warmer against her skin. "What does the message say?" she asked, though part of her already knew. "He demands a bride," Thomas replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "A woman of pure heart and gentle spirit, to renew the binding that keeps him contained. If we refuse—" He swallowed hard. The last village that refused was found as nothing but ash and bone. The three of them walked through the village streets in heavy silence, joining the stream of frightened faces converging on the square. The air itself seemed thicker, charged with supernatural dread. Children clung to their parents' hands, and even the usual morning bustle of commerce had ceased entirely. The village square, normally a place of modest celebration and community gathering, now felt like a tribunal. Elder Aldrich Blackwood stood on the raised platform where merchants typically hawked their wares, his ancient face grave with the weight of terrible knowledge. The other council members flanked him, their expressions ranging from resignation to barely concealed terror. "People of Thornwick," Aldrich's voice carried across the square, steady despite his age. "The time we have long prepared for has arrived. Lord Vaelen has awakened, and the ancient pact demands fulfillment." A murmur of fear rippled through the crowd. Mothers pulled their daughters closer, while fathers stood with shoulders squared against a threat they could neither fight nor flee. "As was agreed by our forefathers, we must provide a bride, a woman of virtue and gentle nature, who will serve to renew his power and maintain the barriers that protect our valley from greater darkness. This is not a choice, but an obligation written in blood and sealed with magic that binds us all." Elira listened with a strange sense of detachment, as if she were observing the scene from a great distance. Around her, she could feel the villagers' eyes beginning to move, searching faces, weighing options. Who among them would be chosen for this terrible honor? Whose daughter, whose sister, whose wife would be sacrificed to appease the monster in the mountain? "The woman chosen," Aldrich continued, must go willingly, with grace and acceptance. This is not merely tradition, it is magical law. A forced sacrifice weakens the binding and endangers us all. Therefore, the Council asks for volunteers, those willing to serve their community in this most sacred and final duty. The silence that followed was deafening. Elira could hear her own heartbeat, feel the crystal pendant pulsing warm against her chest. She thought of her empty cottage, of the life she had built from the ashes of her family's deaths. She thought of the children in the square, wide-eyed with terror, and the elderly who had lived through previous awakenings, who knew exactly what this meant. She thought of her grandmother's stories about courage in the face of darkness, about the power of choosing love over fear, sacrifice over safety. Before conscious thought could override instinct, Elira stepped forward. "I will go." The words rang across the square like a bell's toll, final and irreversible. Every eye turned to her, some with relief, others with horror, all with the complex mixture of gratitude and guilt that comes with witnessing someone else's sacrifice. Elder Blackwood's ancient eyes met hers, and she saw something there she hadn't expected: respect. "Miss Thorne, are you certain?" Once the words are spoken, "I am certain," she said, her voice stronger now. "I have no family left to mourn me, no husband or children to leave behind. My life has been quiet and useful, but perhaps it can be meaningful in its ending." Marta pushed through the crowd, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "Child, no, there must be another way." But Elira had already seen the relief in the faces around her, already felt the shift in the supernatural atmosphere as her acceptance registered with forces beyond mortal understanding. The decision had been made not just with her mind, but with something deeper, a recognition that this had always been her path, her purpose. "When must I go?" she asked Aldrich. "Tonight," he replied solemnly. "The new moon provides the strongest magical channels. You will travel the mountain path at sunset, reach the castle by midnight. The ritual must be completed before dawn, or the compact fails entirely." The crowd began to disperse, some unable to meet her eyes, others offering quiet words of gratitude or blessing. Elira stood in the center of it all, feeling strangely calm. The fear would come later, she knew, but for now there was only a profound sense of rightness, as if her entire life had been leading to this moment. As the square emptied, she noticed the snow had begun to fall more heavily, and for the first time in months, the flakes seemed to glow with their own inner light. Change was coming to Thornwick. She could feel it in her bones, in her blood, in the warm pulse of the crystal at her throat. She had no way of knowing that high in his mountain fortress, Lord Vaelen Mortain was experiencing his own moment of recognition, a stirring not just of hunger, but of something far more dangerous and unexpected. Hope. The mountain path had not been travelled in living memory, yet it remained clear, as if the stones themselves remembered their purpose and refused to let nature reclaim what had been carved for darker necessities. Elira's breath came in sharp puffs as she climbed, each step echoing with supernatural resonance that seemed to announce her approach to whatever waited above. She paused at a switchback to look down at Thornwick, now appearing small and vulnerable in the valley below. Warm lights flickered in cottage windows like fallen stars, each one representing a life she had chosen to protect. The weight of that choice pressed against her chest, but not with regret, with something closer to fierce pride. The leather satchel Elder Blackwood had given her contained provisions for the journey, and something else entirely, the blood-packed scroll. She had seen it briefly when he pressed it into her hands, the ancient parchment seeming to pulse with its own heartbeat. The crimson writing appeared to shift and move when she wasn't looking directly at it, as if the words themselves were alive with malevolent purpose. "Every century," Blackwood had explained in his study, surrounded by books that chronicled their village's dark history, "the compact requires renewal. The blood of the willing, freely given, binds him to our agreement. He gains power. We gain protection from the greater darkness that would consume our world entirely." Now, climbing toward that destiny, Elira wondered, What greater darkness could possibly be worse than sacrificing their daughters to a creature of legend? But the pendant at her throat grew warmer as she ascended, and with that warmth came an understanding she couldn't yet articulate, that perhaps sacrifice and salvation were not always the opposing forces they seemed. The castle emerged from the mountain mist like a fever dream given form. Its towers pierced the low-hanging clouds, their dark stone surfaces carved with patterns that hurt to look at directly. Gargoyles perched along the battlements, their expressions frozen in eternal screams, or perhaps laughter in the moonlight. It was impossible to tell which. Yet for all its imposing presence, Elira noticed something the stories had never mentioned. The castle was crumbling. Vines crept up its walls, stones had fallen from its towers, and many windows stood dark and empty as missing teeth. This was not the pristine fortress of nightmare, but something touched by time and neglect, by a loneliness so profound it had begun to physically manifest. The great doors stood twice her height, carved from black oak and reinforced with iron bands that bore symbols older than Christianity. As she approached, they swung open without sound, revealing a corridor lit by torches that burned without smoke or scent. The invitation was clear, if not exactly welcoming. Inside, the castle's deterioration became even more apparent. Rich tapestries hung in tatters, their once brilliant colors faded to muted shadows. Marble floors were cracked, allowing strange plants to grow in the fissures. This was grandeur in decay, power diminished, but not destroyed. Her footsteps echoed in the vast entry hall, announcing her presence to whatever dwelt in the shadows. She followed the torchlit corridor, guided by an instinct she didn't question, until she reached a massive chamber dominated by a throne carved from a single piece of obsidian. He was waiting for her. Lord Vaelen Mortain sat with the stillness of carved stone, yet every line of his form spoke of contained power. He was not the skeletal horror of children's tales, nor the corpse-pale phantom of whispered fears. Instead, he appeared as a man in his prime, perhaps 35 years of mortal age, with dark hair that fell to his shoulders and features that spoke of nobility and intelligence. His clothes were rich but simple, black wool and silver fastenings cut in a style that suggested centuries of accumulated taste rather than fleeting fashion. But his eyes gave him away. Ancient beyond measure, they held depths that had witnessed the rise and fall of kingdoms, the birth and death of countless mortal lives. When those eyes fixed on her, Elira felt the weight of accumulated time pressing against her consciousness. "You are not what I expected," he said, his voice carrying the resonance of distant thunder. There was surprise in his tone, and something that might have been disappointment. Elira moved closer, her fear transforming into curiosity. Up close, she could see that his supernatural stillness was not peaceful, but tense, as if he were holding himself in check by sheer force of will. "What did you expect, my lord?" "Fear," he replied immediately. "Tears, pleading for mercy or attempting to bargain for your life. The usual human responses to mortality." "I am afraid," she admitted, stopping just beyond arm's reach of his throne. "But fear and surrender are not the same thing, and I came here willingly." Something flickered across his features, confusion perhaps, or recognition. He rose from the throne with fluid grace, and she realized he was taller than she had anticipated, his presence filling the space around him like a physical force. "Willingly," he repeated, as if testing the word's validity. "The scroll spoke of a bride freely given, but I assumed—" He paused, studying her face with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable, but somehow wasn't. "You volunteered yourself." It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. "Yes." "Why?" The simple question carried enormous weight. Why had she stepped forward? Why had she chosen this path when others would have hidden, hoping someone else would pay the price? Elira considered several answers: duty, sacrifice, nobility, before settling on the truth. "Because I have lost everything already, my lord. My parents to plague, my siblings to winter fevers, my hopes for a simple life to the reality of our cursed existence. What I have left is the ability to choose meaning in my ending. If my death can purchase safety for children who still have futures ahead of them, then my life gains a purpose it never had before. Vaelen stared at her for a long moment, and she saw something unprecedented in those ancient eyes. Uncertainty. Whatever he had expected from this encounter, her answer had not been part of his calculations. "You speak of death as if it were inevitable," he said slowly. "Do you understand what the compact truly requires? The willing sacrifice of a bride to renew your power," she recited, "my blood, freely given, to strengthen the bonds that contain the greater darkness." He laughed, but it was a sound without humor. "Is that what they told you? That you would die?" Something cold, that had nothing to do with the castle's temperature, settled in Elira's stomach. "You mean to tell me that I won't?" "Death would be simpler," Vaelen said, beginning to pace around her with predatory grace. "No, little seamstress. The compact requires something far more complex. A bride, yes, but not for an hour or a night. For eternity. You will be bound to me, transformed to share my nature, my hungers, my endless existence. You will become vampire yourself, trapped in this castle until the end of time." The revelation hit her like a physical blow, but she forced herself to remain standing, to keep her expression calm. "I see. And if I refuse now that I know the truth, the compact fails, the barriers fall. The darkness that has been held at bay for centuries floods across your valley like a tide of shadow and madness. Everyone you sought to protect dies in agony, their souls consumed by entities that make me appear as harmless as a house cat." Elira closed her eyes, feeling the weight of true understanding settle upon her shoulders. Not just death, but eternal servitude. Not just sacrifice, but transformation into the very thing their village feared. When she opened her eyes, Vaelen was standing directly before her, close enough that she could see flecks of gold in his dark irises. "Now you understand," he said softly. "Now you can begin to hate me properly." But as she looked into those ancient, weary eyes, what she felt was not hatred. Instead, she saw something that called to the healer in her soul, a pain so deep and old that it had become part of his fundamental nature. He expected her horror, her revulsion, her desperate attempts to flee or fight. What he wasn't prepared for was the question she asked instead. "How long have you been alone?" The question seemed to physically stagger him. His elegant composure cracked, revealing something raw and vulnerable underneath. For a moment, he looked not like an ancient predator, but like a man who had forgotten what kindness felt like. "Does it matter?" he asked, but his voice had lost its commanding resonance. "Everything matters," Elira replied. "You speak of eternal imprisonment as if it were my doom, but what of yours? When did you last have a conversation with someone who wasn't terrified of you? When did you last touch another soul without taking from it?" Vaelen turned away, his shoulders rigid with centuries of accumulated isolation. "You seek to manipulate me with sympathy. It will not work." "I seek to understand you," she corrected. "If we are to be bound together for eternity, should we not at least attempt to know each other?" When he faced her again, his expression had shifted into something unreadable. "You are either very brave or very foolish, Elira Thorne." "Perhaps both," she admitted. "But I am here, and the choice has been made. The question now is what we make of it." For the first time in centuries, Lord Vaelen Mortain found himself without words. This mortal woman, this sacrifice, offered by a frightened village, had just suggested that his eternal curse might be transformed into something resembling partnership. The very concept was so foreign to his experience that he couldn't immediately reject it. And in that moment of hesitation, something began to change in the castle's ancient stones, something that would alter the course of both their destinies forever. The chamber Vaelen led her to would have been magnificent in its prime. Now it spoke of faded grandeur, silk wallpaper peeling at the edges. A four-poster bed, with curtains that had once been deep burgundy, but now appeared rust-colored in the candlelight. Yet someone had clearly prepared for her arrival: fresh linens, a fire crackling in the marble hearth, and on the vanity table a collection of toiletries that suggested thoughtful consideration for her comfort. "You will stay here tonight," Vaelen said, his voice carefully neutral. "The ritual cannot be performed until tomorrow's midnight. The new moon's darkest hour provides the strongest magical channels." Elira moved to the window, pulling aside heavy curtains to reveal a view that took her breath away. The castle perched on the mountain's edge, offering a vista of the entire valley below. Thornwick's lights twinkled like earthbound stars, peaceful and unaware of the drama unfolding above. "It's beautiful," she said softly. Behind her, she heard the soft intake of breath that suggested surprise. "You find beauty in this place?" She turned to face him, noting how he remained near the doorway as if prepared to flee. "I find beauty in many things others overlook. Perhaps it comes from spending my days mending what appears broken beyond repair." Vaelen stepped into the room, and she noticed an ornate silver mirror hanging on the far wall. Unlike the other furnishings, it seemed untouched by time's passage, its surface gleaming with an inner light that had nothing to do with the fire's reflection. When she moved closer, something extraordinary happened. Instead of showing her travel-worn appearance, the glass revealed something else entirely. Her reflection showed not her physical form, but something deeper. Threads of golden light emanated from her heart, flowing outward like the warm glow she created when working with needle and thread. It was her soul made visible, and it pulsed with life and compassion, despite the fear that still lingered in her chest. But when Vaelen moved into the mirror's view, his reflection told a different story entirely. Darkness surrounded him, yes, but not the absolute void she might have expected. Instead, it was like looking at a night sky, vast and deep, but shot through with distant stars, points of light that spoke of humanity not destroyed but buried, waiting for the right conditions to shine again. "The mirror of souls," Vaelen said quietly, noticing her fascination. "One of the few magical artifacts that still functions in this place. It shows not what we appear to be, but what we truly are." "Then you are not the monster you pretend to be," Elira observed. His laugh held centuries of bitter experience. "Do not mistake buried humanity for virtue. Those lights you see are merely echoes of who I was before my transformation. They change nothing about what I am now." Elira studied his reflection more carefully. The points of light weren't static, they pulsed and moved, responding to his emotions. As they spoke, she noticed them growing slightly brighter, as if their conversation itself was feeding something long dormant within him. "What were you before?" she asked. "Before the curse, before the centuries of isolation, who was Vaelen Mortain?" For a moment, his carefully maintained composure slipped entirely. In the mirror, she watched the lights in his darkness flicker more intensely, and she realized her question had struck something deep and largely forgotten. "I was a lord," he said finally. "Not this mountain fortress, but lands in what you would now call the Loire Valley. I had vineyards, tenant farmers, responsibilities to my people. I was young and believed in justice, in using power to protect rather than dominate." His voice grew distant. "I was also desperately in love." The admission hung in the air between them, vulnerable and unexpected. Elira waited, sensing that pushing would cause him to retreat into his defensive coldness. "Her name was Isabel," he continued, his eyes fixed on the mirror's surface, where his reflected darkness seemed to pulse with old pain. "A healer from the village, beautiful and kind, and utterly convinced that love could conquer any darkness. When the plague came to my lands, she worked tirelessly to save lives, including mine when I fell ill. She saved you. She tried to." His hand moved unconsciously to his chest, as if touching an old wound. "The plague should have killed me, but her healing magic was stronger than the disease. Unfortunately, it was also strong enough to attract the attention of something far worse than mortal illness." Elira felt pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to align. The entity that cursed you. A creature of shadow and hunger that had been watching our lands, waiting for someone with enough life force to serve its purposes. Isabel's magic made me a perfect vessel, strong enough to contain its power, noble enough to command respect, isolated enough by my position to be vulnerable. In the mirror, she could see his reflection growing more turbulent, the points of light struggling against waves of darkness that seemed to respond to the painful memory. It offered me a choice, Vaelen said. Accept its curse and become vampire, or watch it consume every soul in my territory, starting with Isabel. The decision was simple. Reno, you sacrificed yourself to save her. I thought I did. His voice turned bitter. But the creature had lied about the nature of its bargain. The transformation didn't just make me vampire. It created an endless hunger that could only be satisfied by consuming what I most loved. The first person I fed from was Isabel herself. The revelation hit Elira like a physical blow. She understood now the depth of his isolation, the weight of guilt that had shaped centuries of existence. He hadn't chosen darkness. He had been trapped by love and betrayed by the very sacrifice he made to protect others. I killed the woman I loved, he said quietly, with my own hands, my own newfound hunger. Her life force was what completed my transformation, and her death was what bound me to this place forever. But you've protected the valley, Elira pointed out. All these centuries, you've honored the compact that keeps greater darkness at bay. Penance, he said simply. The only meaning I could find in immortality was using my cursed nature to prevent others from suffering what my people suffered. Elira moved away from the mirror, understanding now why he had expected fear and hatred from her. His story was one of love transformed into horror, of good intentions twisted into eternal punishment. Yet what she felt wasn't revulsion, but a deep, aching compassion for the centuries of loneliness he had endured. You blame yourself for being deceived, she said. I blame myself for not being strong enough to find another way. Sometimes there is no other way, Elira replied. Sometimes the only choice is between terrible and unthinkable, and we must live with the consequences of choosing terrible. Vaelen looked at her sharply, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. You speak as someone who has made such choices. I have, she admitted. When the plague came to Thornwick, I had medicine enough to save my family or 3 neighbor children whose parents had already died. I chose the children. The confession hung between them, a shared understanding of the weight that came with impossible decisions. In the mirror, Elira could see her own golden threads pulsing with old pain, while the lights in Vaelen's darkness seemed to respond with recognition and something that might have been comfort. You chose strangers over blood, he said softly. I chose the future over the past, she corrected. My parents were already dying. The children had their whole lives ahead of them. For the first time since their meeting, Vaelen smiled, not the cold expression of earlier, but something genuine and warm. I begin to understand why the compact chose you specifically. You are not the innocent sacrifice they believed they were offering. No, Elira agreed. I am something much more dangerous, a woman who understands exactly what darkness looks like and chooses compassion anyway. Dawn brought no sun to the mountain castle, only a gradual shift from black to grey that filtered through the heavy clouds surrounding the peaks. Elira woke to find a breakfast tray beside her bed, simple fare of bread, cheese and fruit that somehow tasted better than the finest meals from her village. When she made her way downstairs, following the sound of distant music, she discovered something that challenged every story she had ever heard about Lord Vaelen Mortain. He was playing piano. The melody drifted through the castle's corridors like a living thing, complex and beautiful and utterly at odds with the image of a soulless predator. Elira followed the sound through winding passages until she found him in what had once been a grand salon. The room showed the same elegant decay as the rest of the castle, but here someone had made an effort at preservation. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, their leather bindings carefully maintained despite their obvious age. Vaelen sat at a magnificent grand piano, his fingers moving across the keys with practiced ease. The piece he played was melancholy, but not despairing, more like a lament for something beautiful that had been lost, but not forgotten. When he became aware of her presence, his hands stilled on the keys. "I did not mean to disturb your morning," she said softly. "You did not disturb me," he replied, though he made no move to continue playing. "I often forget that others can hear." Elira moved closer, noting the sheets of handwritten music scattered across the piano's surface. The notations were in his elegant script, suggesting he composed as well as performed. "You wrote these? A way to mark the passing of time," he said, a slight flush of color touching his pale cheeks. "When you have centuries to fill, you either develop interests beyond mere survival, or you go mad." She picked up one of the compositions, studying the complex notation. The title was written in flowing script, Isabel's Garden. Her heart ached for him, understanding that his music was how he kept the memory of his lost love alive. "This is beautiful work," she said. "You have genuine talent." "Talent requires an audience," Vaelen replied. "These are merely exercises in nostalgia." Elira set the sheet music aside and moved to the massive windows that dominated the salon's far wall. Through the glass, she could see what had once been gardens stretching down the mountainside in terraced levels. Now they were overgrown and wild, but she could still make out the bones of their original design pathways that curved like musical phrases, planting beds arranged in patterns that suggested careful artistry. "The Garden of Memory," Vaelen said, following her gaze. "Isabel designed it during the brief time we had together. She said that a garden was like a song made visible each season, bringing new movements, new harmonies of color and scent." The bitterness in his voice couldn't quite hide the love that still colored every word. Elira pressed her palm against the cold glass, imagining what the gardens must have looked like in their prime, what it must have meant to him to watch them slowly die along with everything else he had cherished. "Why haven't you maintained them?" The question seemed to surprise him. "I am a creature of darkness. Living things wither in my presence." "That's not true," Elira said firmly. "The roses in my room are blooming beautifully, and I noticed fresh herbs growing in the kitchen garden. If you truly killed everything you touched, this entire mountain would be barren stone." Vaelen was quiet for a long moment, and she could see him considering her words, perhaps examining beliefs he had held for centuries without question. "The truth is," he said finally, "I stopped tending them because it hurt too much. Every flower that bloomed reminded me of her smile. Every withered plant felt like losing her again." The admission was so quietly vulnerable that Elira felt her heart break a little for this ancient, lonely man who had convinced himself that isolation was penance rather than simply another form of self-inflicted suffering. "Grief is love with nowhere to go," she said. "But that doesn't mean love has to die with the person we've lost." She turned from the window to find him watching her with an expression of such raw longing that she almost stepped back. Not longing for her specifically, but for the possibility she represented the chance that isolation was a choice rather than an inevitability. "You speak as if you know something of loss," he said. "I know that when my parents died, I stopped cooking their favorite meals, stopped visiting the places we had shared, stopped doing anything that reminded me of their absence. It took me 3 years to realize that I wasn't honoring their memory, I was burying it." "And what changed your mind?" Elira smiled, remembering. "A little girl in the village asked me to teach her embroidery. Her stitches were clumsy, her patience limited, but her enthusiasm reminded me so much of my mother trying to teach me the same skills. I realized that keeping love alive meant sharing it, not hiding it." Vaelen moved to stand beside her at the window, close enough that she could feel the subtle coolness that surrounded him like an aura. Up close, she noticed details the previous night's dramatic revelations had obscured the way. His dark hair caught highlights despite the grey morning light, the elegant strength of his hands, the fact that while pale, he didn't possess the corpse-like pallor of legend. "You would have me tend dead gardens for the sake of memory?" he asked. "I would have you tend living gardens for the sake of hope," she replied. "If we are to be bound together, should we not create something beautiful rather than simply existing in beautiful decay?" The word "we" seemed to resonate through him like a struck bell. When was the last time, Elira wondered, that he had made plans that included another person? When had he last considered a future that involved creation rather than mere endurance? "The binding ritual," he said, his voice carefully controlled, "will change you irrevocably. You understand this?" "I understand that I will become vampire," she replied. "But I also understand that vampires are not incapable of growth, of joy, of purpose, beyond mere survival. You are proof of that." "I am proof of stagnation," he corrected. "I have spent centuries trapped in amber, preserving pain rather than processing it. Then, perhaps, it's time for that to change." Elira placed her hand over his where it rested on the windowsill. His skin was cool but not cold, and she felt a subtle vibration beneath the surface, as if some deeply buried part of him was stirring to life. "You cannot know what you're suggesting," Vaelen said, but he didn't pull away from her touch. "I'm suggesting that two people who understand loss and sacrifice might find ways to heal together that neither could manage alone," she replied. "I'm suggesting that eternal partnership need not be eternal punishment." For a moment, the clouds outside parted, allowing a shaft of actual sunlight to fall across the abandoned gardens. Instead of recoiling, Vaelen watched in fascination as the light revealed colors that had been hidden in shadow, the deep green of hardy vines, the subtle purple of winter-flowering heather, the bright red of rose hips that had somehow survived the neglect. "Perhaps," he said softly, "you are right." The crystal pendant at Elira's throat had been growing warmer throughout the morning, but when the shadows in the corridor began moving independently of their sources, it became almost too hot to bear. She was exploring the castle's library, marveling at texts that chronicled centuries of supernatural knowledge, when the temperature dropped so suddenly her breath became visible. "Vaelen," she called, but her voice seemed muffled, as if the very air had thickened around her. The shadows coalesced into something almost humanoid, not quite solid, but substantial enough to radiate malevolent intent. A voice spoke without words, pressing directly against her consciousness with images of darkness consuming light, of ancient powers that would not be denied their due. Then Vaelen was there, moving with inhuman speed to place himself between her and the shadow thing. When he spoke, his voice carried an authority that made the castle walls themselves seem to vibrate. "You have no power here without my permission," he commanded. "Return to whatever realm sent you." The shadow writhed, and Elira felt its attention turn to her with predatory interest. The pendant against her skin pulsed, and suddenly she could understand the wordless communication flooding through the room. The compact was being watched, judged. The entities that had originally bound Vaelen to his role were growing concerned about the deviation from established patterns. Previous brides had either died in terror or accepted their fate with broken resignation. None had spoken of partnership, of hope, of transformation through mutual understanding. "They fear you," Elira said as the shadow thing dissolved, leaving them alone in the suddenly warm library. "The powers that created this situation, they're afraid of what we might become together." Vaelen's expression was grim. "They should be." The compact was designed to maintain balance through suffering. A vampire lord bound by isolation and guilt, renewed each century by consuming the life force of another victim. But if the bride were to survive the transformation willingly, if we were to find genuine partnership instead of predator and prey, the balance shifts, Elira completed. Instead of containing darkness through suffering, we might contain it through strength. Or we might destroy everything, Vaelen warned. The supernatural realm operates on principles of cosmic equilibrium. Too much change too quickly can shatter barriers that have held for millennia. The pendant at her throat pulsed again, and this time Elira felt something else, a warmth that had nothing to do with magical warning. She pulled the crystal from beneath her dress, gasping as she saw it had begun to emit a soft, golden light. "What is it?" Vaelen asked, moving closer to examine the pendant. "My grandmother's necklace," Elira replied. "She said it had been in our family for generations, that it would glow when true emotion ran deep." As she spoke, the light intensified slightly, responding to her honesty. Vaelen's eyes widened with recognition. "May I?" When she nodded, he lifted the pendant carefully, his cool fingers brushing against her warm skin. The moment he touched the crystal, it blazed with brilliant light, illuminating the entire library. "This is not merely a family heirloom," he said quietly. "This is a piece of heartstone crystallized emotion made manifest. They are extraordinarily rare and extraordinarily powerful." "What does it do?" "It reveals truth," Vaelen replied, his voice filled with wonder. "But more than that, it stores genuine feeling, pure emotion distilled into physical form. In the right circumstances, with enough accumulated love and hope and authentic human connection, it can act as a focus for transformation magic." The implications hit them both simultaneously. The pendant wasn't just glowing because of their growing bond, it was potentially the key to changing the nature of the binding ritual itself. Instead of a ceremony designed to drain her life force and trap them both in supernatural servitude, it might be possible to create something entirely new. But as they contemplated this possibility, the castle around them began to react. Stone walls groaned with stress, and through the windows they could see unnatural storm clouds gathering around the mountain peaks. The supernatural realm was not pleased with this development. "We don't have until midnight," Vaelen said grimly. "If they sense we might succeed in transforming the compact, they'll intervene directly. How long do we have?" "Hours, perhaps less." He moved to the library's ancient texts, pulling volumes from shelves with practiced efficiency. There are precedents, old stories of binding rituals that were modified by participants, but the magical requirements are complex, and the risks. "What risks?" Vaelen's hands stilled on the books. "If we attempt the transformation and fail, the backlash won't just kill us, it will shatter the barriers protecting your valley entirely. Every dark entity that has been held at bay for centuries will flood across the land like a tsunami of shadow. Everyone you sought to protect will die anyway. Only their deaths will be far more horrible than simple vampire predation." The weight of that knowledge settled between them like a physical presence. They were no longer just risking their own lives and futures, but the survival of everyone in Thornwick. The courage required to proceed was vastly different from the courage that had brought her to the castle in the first place. "Tell me about the original witch," Elira said suddenly. "The one who cursed you. What was her name?" "Morgana Thorn," Vaelen replied, then stopped, staring at her. "Thorn. Your family name is Thorn," Elira confirmed, "which means Morgana was my ancestor." She felt the pieces clicking into place, understanding finally why the pendant had been passed down through her family line, why she had always been sensitive to supernatural currents, why the compact had specifically called for her. "You're not just the bride the village offered," Vaelen said slowly. "You're the descendant of the woman who created this entire situation. The magic has been building toward this moment for centuries." "Then I have the right to change what she created," Elira said firmly. "If Morgana Thorn bound you to darkness through grief and rage, then perhaps Elira Thorn can bind you to light through hope and love." The pendant flared brighter, as if responding to her determination. Through the library windows, lightning split the storm-dark sky, and they could hear the distant sounds of supernatural forces massing for what might be the final confrontation. The ritual must be performed at the heart of the castle, Vaelen said, gathering the books they would need, in the chamber where I was first transformed. But Elira, you must understand, even if we succeed, we will both be changed. Neither of us will be entirely human when this is finished. I stopped being entirely human the moment I chose love over fear, she replied. The question isn't what we'll become, but whether we'll become it together. As they prepared to descend into the castle's deepest chambers, the storm outside intensified, and shadows began moving through the corridors with renewed malevolence. Time was running out, and the supernatural forces arrayed against them were preparing for war. The heart of Castle Mortain lay 3 levels below the main foundations, carved directly into the mountain's living rock. As they descended through corridors that grew progressively colder and more oppressive, Elira could feel the weight of centuries pressing down upon them. The walls here bore no decoration, no attempt at beauty, only stark stone surfaces marked with symbols that seemed to writhe when caught in peripheral vision. Vaelen carried a torch that burned with supernatural flame, casting dancing shadows that seemed almost alive in their movements. The deeper they went, the more his posture changed, becoming more rigid, more defensive. This was not merely a journey through his castle, but a pilgrimage to the site of his greatest trauma. The chamber ahead was where Isabel died, he said quietly as they reached a heavy iron door. Where I killed her. I have not returned here in over 2 centuries. Elira placed her hand on his arm, feeling the tension that ran through him like a taut wire. We can find another place. No, he interrupted. The transformation magic is strongest where it was first anchored. If we're to have any chance of success, it must be here. The door opened at his touch, revealing a circular chamber dominated by a raised dais in the center. Upon the dais sat something that made Elira's breath catch in her throat, a smooth stone that pulsed with its own heartbeat, emanating warmth despite the chamber's chill. The heartstone was larger than her pendant, roughly the size of a human heart, and its surface showed veins of gold that moved like living arteries. It's beautiful, she whispered. It's a fragment of her soul, Vaelen replied, his voice thick with old grief. When she died, her life force didn't dissipate entirely. Part of it crystallized into this stone, binding my transformation to her essence. It's why the castle doesn't decay completely, why some rooms still hold warmth, why the gardens haven't entirely died. She's still here, in a way. Around the chamber's walls, carved niches held the remains of previous brides, not bones, but crystalline formations that caught the torchlight like frozen tears. Each one represented a woman who had come before Elira. Each one a life sacrificed to maintain the supernatural balance. They didn't die, Elira realized. They were transformed into something else entirely, into pure life force, Vaelen confirmed, trapped between life and death, conscious but unable to act, speak, or escape. It is a fate worse than simple mortality. The pendant at Elira's throat began to resonate with the heartstone, creating a harmonic vibration that filled the chamber with ethereal music. As the 2 crystals responded to each other, something unprecedented began to happen. The crystalline remains in the wall, niches started to glow, and whispers filled the air. The voices of the previous brides, speaking for the first time in centuries. Free us, they pleaded in harmonized whispers. Break the chains that bind us to this endless twilight. We have been waiting, said another voice, clearer than the rest, waiting for one who could choose transformation instead of consumption. Elira moved closer to the niches, her heart breaking for these women who had suffered fates beyond imagination. How? How can we free you? The ritual of transformation, came the reply. If performed with willing hearts and genuine love, it can unravel all the bindings, not just create new ones, but the risk. Tell me, Elira demanded. If you fail, we all become nothing. Our consciousness finally extinguished, our essence scattered to the winds, and the darkness we have helped contain will be unleashed upon the world. Vaelen had moved to stand beside the heartstone, his face pale with the weight of this revelation. "You're asking us to risk not just our own souls, but yours as well. Centuries of women who died to protect the world. We're asking you to choose hope over fear," the voices replied, "as we never could, as no one has been able to, until now." The supernatural storm outside intensified, and through the chamber's single window, a narrow slit carved high in the wall, they could see darkness gathering like a living thing. The entities that controlled the supernatural realm were preparing for direct intervention. "They're coming," Vaelen said grimly. "We have perhaps an hour before they breach the castle's defenses entirely." Elira approached the heartstone, feeling its warmth wash over her like a physical embrace. When she placed her palm against its surface, visions flooded her mind, memories that belonged to Isabel, showing her the woman Vaelen had loved. A healer with gentle hands and fierce determination, someone who had chosen love even knowing it might lead to tragedy. "She doesn't blame you," Elira said softly, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Isabel, I can feel her presence in the stone. She doesn't blame you for what happened." Vaelen's composure finally cracked. He sank to his knees beside the dais, centuries of guilt and self-recrimination pouring out of him in racking sobs. "I should have found another way. I should have been stronger, smarter, more worthy of her love." "You were human," Elira replied, kneeling beside him, "making impossible choices in impossible circumstances. She knew the risks when she chose to heal you. She knew the danger when she chose to love you. And she chose anyway, because that's what love is, the decision to hope despite uncertainty." The heartstone's pulsing grew stronger, and Elira realized that Vaelen's acceptance of forgiveness was feeding power into the crystallized love at the chamber's heart. The pendant around her neck blazed brighter, creating a connection between past and present, between Isabel's sacrifice and Elira's choice. "The ritual," she said urgently. "We need to begin it now, while the stones are in resonance." But even as they prepared to attempt the transformation that might save or damn them all, the chamber's iron door burst open. Dark figures poured through, not shadows this time, but entities with solid form and malevolent intent. Creatures of pure supernatural force, sent to ensure the compact was fulfilled according to its original terms. "Lord Mortain," their leader spoke with a voice like grinding stone, "you will complete the binding as ordained, or face consequences that extend far beyond your mountain." "And if I refuse?" Vaelen asked, rising to stand protectively in front of Elira. "Then we will take the woman anyway, drain her life force for our own purposes, and release every dark entity we have contained for the past 3 centuries upon your precious valley. Your people will die screaming, and their suffering will fuel our power for millennia." The ultimatum hung in the chamber's air like poison. Complete the traditional binding that would trap Elira in crystalline torment, or watch everyone they sought to protect suffer fates infinitely worse. But as Elira's hand found Vaelen's, as the heartstone and her pendant sang together in harmonic resonance, as the voices of the previous brides whispered their encouragement, she realized that sometimes the greatest courage lay not in accepting terrible choices, but in refusing to believe they were the only options available. "There is a third choice," she said, her voice ringing with newfound determination. "We transform everything." The supernatural entities advanced into the chamber with predatory confidence, their forms shifting between shadow and substance, as if they couldn't quite decide which state better suited their malevolent purposes. But as they drew closer to the heartstone, something unexpected happened. They began to recoil, their shapes wavering as if the crystallized love was causing them physical pain. "Impossible," their leader hissed. "The heartstone should be dormant. The woman has not yet been bound." Elira felt the pendant at her throat growing almost unbearably hot, and with that heat came a flood of memories that didn't belong to her. Images of a woman with dark hair and fierce eyes, standing in this very chamber centuries ago, weaving magic with desperate determination. The woman looked exactly like Elira might in 30 years, the same bone structure, the same resolute expression, the same pendant blazing at her throat. "Morgana," she whispered, understanding flooding through her consciousness. Vaelen spun to look at her, his eyes wide with recognition. "You're seeing her memories. The blood connection is stronger than we realized." But what Elira was seeing challenged everything they thought they knew about the original curse. In the vision, Morgana Thorne wasn't casting a spell of vengeance against an innocent lord. Instead, she was making a desperate bargain to contain something far worse, a cosmic entity of pure darkness that had been consuming entire realms, working its way through dimensions until it reached their world. "She didn't curse you," Elira said, her voice filled with awe and horror. "She saved you, saved everyone." The supernatural entities in the chamber froze, their attention snapping to her with sudden alarm. They had not expected her to access those particular memories. "Explain," Vaelen demanded, though his eyes never left their supernatural opponents. Through the pendant's connection to Morgana's memories, Elira could see the true history unfolding. The plague that had struck Vaelen's lands hadn't been natural, it had been the first probe of the cosmic entity, testing the boundaries of their reality. When Morgana's healing magic saved Vaelen, it had marked him as someone with unusual resilience, making him a potential vessel. "The entity that approached you wasn't some random dark creature," Elira said, the words pouring out as fast as the visions came. "It was an advanced scout for something called the consuming dark, a force that devours entire realities. But Morgana had been tracking it, studying it, preparing defenses. In the memory, she could see Morgana arriving at Vaelen's castle just as the entity was completing his transformation. But instead of fighting it directly, she had done something far more clever and dangerous. She had modified the binding, turning what was meant to be the first step in universal consumption into a containment spell. She bound the entity's power to you," Elira continued, "but not as its servant, as its prison. Every century, when the binding weakened, a new source of pure human will and love would strengthen the cage. The brides weren't being sacrificed to feed you, they were choosing to help you contain something that would have destroyed everything." The leader of the supernatural entities let out a sound of pure fury. She was not supposed to remember. The bloodline memories were supposed to remain dormant until after the binding. "But they didn't," Vaelen said quietly, pieces falling into place in his own mind. "Because this time, the bride and the prison fell in love. Genuine love, not the fear-based compliance of previous centuries." Elira's pendant blazed brighter, and suddenly she could hear Morgana's voice as clearly as if her ancestor were standing beside her. "The spell was designed to evolve," the voice said. "Each century it grew stronger, more complex. I knew that eventually someone would come who could complete the final transformation." "What final transformation?" Elira asked aloud. The supernatural entities lunged forward, desperate to stop what was happening, but the combined power of the Heartstone and Elira's pendant created a barrier they couldn't cross. Light blazed through the chamber, and the crystalline remains of previous brides began to sing in harmony. Morgana's voice continued, now audible to everyone present. "The prison can become permanent. The consuming dark can be bound forever. Not just contained, but only if the prison and the key choose each other freely, with full knowledge of what they're accepting. I am the prison," Vaelen said slowly, "and Elira is the key. But not just any key," Morgana's spirit explained. "The final key, the one who carries my bloodline and my power, who can choose love over fear, hope over despair. Together, you can lock the consuming dark away for all eternity, but only if you do so as willing partners, not as master and sacrifice." The implications were staggering. For centuries, the supernatural entities they faced had been agents of the very force Morgana had contained. They had maintained the binding ritual not to protect the world, but to ensure the prison remained temporary, that eventually the consuming dark would break free. "You've been lying to us," Elira accused the entities. "All these centuries, you've been working toward your master's eventual release. The compact serves the greater balance," their leader replied. But its voice now held the hint of desperation. "Some realities must be consumed so that others can flourish." "Not this one," Vaelen said firmly. "Not while I have breath in my body." The heartstone pulsed stronger, and suddenly Elira could feel the presence of every bride who had come before her, not as separate individuals, but as parts of a growing spell, each one adding her will and strength to the containment. They had not been victims, they had been heroes, knowingly sacrificing their individual existence to protect everyone they loved. "But now you can free them," Morgana's voice said gently. "The final binding doesn't require their continued imprisonment. Their purpose was to strengthen the spell until it could be made permanent. Once that's accomplished, they can finally rest." Tears streamed down Elira's face as she understood the full scope of what her ancestor had accomplished. A spell that had taken centuries to mature, that had required the willing sacrifice of dozens of brave women, all leading to this moment when everything could finally be made right. "The ritual?" she asked. "Different from anything attempted before," Morgana replied. "Not a binding of sacrifice, but a binding of choice. You must both accept transformation not into predator and prey, but into guardians. Vampire and sorceress, prison and key, working together to ensure the consuming dark never threatens any reality again." The supernatural entities were retreating now, their forms beginning to dissolve as the truth of their deception became undeniable. But their leader made one last, desperate attempt. "If you succeed, you will be bound to this duty forever," it snarled. "No escape, no reprieve, no hope of normal existence. Is your love worth eternal servitude?" Vaelen and Elira looked at each other, and in that moment their choice was clear. They had already chosen each other despite impossible circumstances. They had already accepted that their path would be different from ordinary lives. The only question now was whether they would spend eternity as victims of circumstance or as partners in purpose. "Yes," they said together, their voices creating harmony in the crystalline chamber. The heartstone exploded with light, the pendant at Elira's throat sang with power, and the voices of the previous brides rose in a chorus of joy and release. But even as they prepared for the transformation ritual, they could feel something stirring in the depths beyond the chamber, the consuming dark itself, awakening to the threat of permanent imprisonment. The final battle was about to begin, and its outcome would determine the fate of not just their world, but every reality in existence. But for the first time in centuries, the forces of light had genuine hope on their side. And hope, as Morgana Thorne had learned long ago, was the most powerful magic of all. The chamber trembled as the consuming dark stirred in the depths beneath the castle, its awakening sending shockwaves through the very foundations of reality. Ancient stones cracked, and through the fissures seeped a darkness so complete it seemed to devour light itself. Elira felt the pendant at her throat burning against her skin, its warmth the only thing standing between her consciousness and the overwhelming despair that radiated from the entity below. "How long do we have?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady as Morgana's memories continued to flood through her awareness. Vaelen pressed his palm against the heartstone, his face pale with concentration. "Minutes, perhaps less. It's been dormant for so long that its awakening will be violent and chaotic. But once it fully consciousness, it will strike with intelligence and purpose." Through the narrow window, they could see the effect spreading beyond the castle. The storm clouds above the mountain were turning an unnatural shade of black shot through with veins of sickly green light. In the distance, Thornwick's peaceful lights began to flicker and dim, as if the very essence of hope was being drained from the valley. "The people," Elira whispered, horror filling her chest. Not yet, Vaelen said grimly. But soon. The consuming dark feeds on despair and terror. As it grows stronger, it will influence their dreams, their thoughts, turning neighbor against neighbor until the entire village destroys itself from within. The crystalline remains of the previous brides hummed with increasing urgency, their voices blending into a chorus of warning and encouragement. Through their combined wisdom, Elira began to understand the complexity of the ritual they needed to perform. From Morgana's memories, she accessed the theoretical framework her ancestor had constructed. The final binding required three elements working in perfect harmony: the prison, Vaelen; the key, herself; and the focus, the ceremonial dagger that lay hidden in a compartment beneath the heartstone. But unlike previous rituals that had relied on sacrifice and consumption, this one demanded something far more difficult: absolute trust and perfect synchronization between two souls choosing to merge their destinies. "The dagger," Elira said, moving to the base of the dais. Following the instructions flowing through her inherited memories, she pressed her palm against a seemingly blank section of stone. A hidden panel slid aside, revealing a blade that seemed to be forged from crystallized starlight. The weapon hummed with power, its edge sharp enough to cut through magical bonds or mortal flesh with equal ease. Vaelen joined her beside the dais, his expression grave as he examined the ritual blade. "I remember this from the night Isabel died, but then it was used to drain life force, to fuel my transformation. This time we use it to bind our lives together," Elira completed, "not in dominance and submission, but in partnership. But Vaelen, if we fail, the consuming dark escapes its prison and devours this reality, then moves on to the next, and the next, until existence itself becomes nothing but an endless void of hunger." His hand covered hers where she gripped the dagger's hilt. "But if we succeed, we become eternal guardians, bound to watch over the prison for the rest of time. Together," she said firmly. "Whatever comes, we face it together." The building shook again, more violently this time, and they could hear something moving in the deeper chambers below, something vast and alien and utterly hostile to everything they understood as life. The supernatural entities that had fled earlier were returning, but not as enemies this time. The deception exposed, they now appeared in their true forms as fragments of previous realities that the consuming dark had partially consumed, refugees who had been fighting a guerrilla war across dimensions. "The time has come," their leader said, its form now showing the outlines of what might once have been human. "We can provide you with what protection we can, but the binding itself must be your choice, your power, your will." Through the window, Elira could see lights moving on the mountain paths, not the warm glow of lanterns, but the cold illumination of supernatural forces gathering for the final confrontation. Some came as allies, ancient spirits of the mountain itself, awakening to defend their domain. Forest creatures that had felt the poison of the consuming dark seeping into their realm. Even what appeared to be dragons, beings of such power that they existed partially outside normal reality. But others came as enemies, shadow things spawned by the dark's influence, corrupted spirits that had been turned by centuries of proximity to the cosmic threat, and worst of all, echoes of the realities that had already been consumed, empty, hungry ghosts of entire civilizations that now served their destroyer. "The castle is about to become a battlefield," Vaelen observed, watching the forces array themselves across the mountainside. "Then we complete the ritual before the battle reaches us," Elira replied. She turned to face the Heartstone, feeling Morgana's presence strengthening within her consciousness. Through her ancestors' memories, she could see exactly how the binding must be performed, but the knowledge came with a terrible understanding of the price. "Vaelen, when we begin this, we won't be the same people anymore. The transformation will change us fundamentally, not just in our abilities, but in our essential nature. We'll be connected to each other and to the prison in ways that..." She struggled to find words for something that existed beyond normal human experience. "Will be one consciousness in two bodies," he said quietly. "I know. I can feel it already, the way your thoughts are beginning to echo in my mind, the way my awareness seems to expand when you're near. The ritual doesn't create the bond, it just makes permanent something that has already begun." It was true. Over the past day, Elira had noticed increasing moments when she could sense his emotions as clearly as her own, when his memories seemed to overlay her perceptions. The heartstone and her pendant had been preparing them for this merger, gradually aligning their consciousness so that the final binding wouldn't shatter their individual souls. A sound like cosmic thunder echoed from below, and the chamber floor cracked, revealing a glimpse of something that hurt to perceive directly, a presence of such malevolent hunger that looking at it felt like staring into the heat death of the universe itself. "Now," Elira said urgently. "It has to be now." They moved to opposite sides of the heartstone, the ritual dagger between them on the crystalline surface. Following Morgana's precise instructions, they began to speak the words of binding not in any human language, but in the fundamental vocabulary of creation itself, words that shaped reality at its most basic level. As they spoke, the pendant at Elira's throat and the heartstone began to resonate in perfect harmony, their combined power creating a circle of protection around the dais. The voices of the previous brides joined their incantation, adding layers of meaning and strength that had been building for centuries. But even as they began the ritual, the consuming dark struck back with desperate fury. The chamber floor exploded upward, and tendrils of absolute nothingness erupted from the depths, seeking to disrupt the binding before it could be completed. The supernatural allies outside began their own battle, holding off the dark servants while trying to maintain a protective barrier around the castle's heart. "Don't stop," Vaelen commanded as reality twisted around them. "No matter what happens, don't stop the incantation." Elira nodded, though keeping her concentration on the ritual words became increasingly difficult as the world seemingly came apart around them. Through the chaos, she could feel the other brides lending her their strength, Morgana's spirit guiding her pronunciation of words that human throats were never meant to speak. The dagger between them began to glow with its own inner fire, and Elira understood that the moment of final choice was approaching. Soon, they would take up the blade and seal their union in the oldest way, magic recognized with freely given blood and willingly shared life force. But as they reached the crescendo of the incantation, as the forces of light and darkness clashed in cosmic battle around them, both Elira and Vaelen felt a moment of perfect clarity. Whatever they had been before this moment, whatever they would become after, this was their choice, made in full knowledge of its cost and consequences. They reached for the dagger together, their hands meeting on its crystalline hilt, and spoke the final word of transformation that would bind them together for all eternity. The moment their hands touched the ritual dagger's hilt, reality exploded around them. The chamber filled with blinding light as the heartstone and Elira's pendant created a resonance that shook the foundations of existence itself. But even as their combined power blazed forth, the consuming dark erupted from the depths with a roar that existed beyond sound, a vibration that struck directly at the soul. Tendrils of absolute nothingness lashed through the chamber, each one capable of erasing whatever it touched from existence entirely. The crystalline remains of the previous brides blazed with protective light, their sacrifice finally given full purpose as they formed a barrier of pure will against the cosmic horror below. "The circle!" Vaelen shouted over the chaos, his voice strained with the effort of maintaining the incantation while dodging attacks that could unmake him entirely. Around the base of the dais, ancient stones began to glow, a binding circle that had been carved into the chamber's floor centuries ago, activated now by their combined blood and determination. The circle pulsed with each word of the transformation ritual, growing stronger as their voices harmonized with the chorus of previous brides. But the consuming dark had learned from centuries of imprisonment. Instead of attacking them directly, it began to assault the foundations of their resolve. Elira found her mind flooded with visions of failure, images of Thornwick burning, of everyone she loved dying in agony because she had been too proud to accept the simple sacrifice originally demanded. "It's trying to break your concentration," Morgana's voice whispered urgently in her consciousness. "The dark feeds on doubt and despair. You must hold to what you know is true." Elira gritted her teeth, forcing herself to focus on the ritual blade's warmth beneath her palm, on Vaelen's steady presence beside her, on the voices of brave women who had given everything to reach this moment. The visions wavered and began to lose their power over her thoughts. Vaelen faced his own assault. Memories of Isabel's death played endlessly, each repetition showing him new ways he could have failed, new reasons why he deserved centuries of guilt and isolation. But as the dark's manipulation intensified, something unexpected happened. Instead of breaking under the renewed weight of self-recrimination, he felt Elira's strength flowing through their growing connection, her absolute certainty that he was worthy of love and redemption. "Together," she said, her voice somehow carrying clearly despite the cosmic chaos surrounding them, "we are stronger together than anything we face apart." The binding circle flared brighter, its light pushing back the encroaching darkness. But the circle was only the beginning. The true ritual required them to merge their life forces while maintaining perfect trust in each other and in the rightness of their choice. Following Morgana's guidance, Elira drew the blade across her palm, letting her blood fall onto the heartstone. The crystallized essence of Isabel's love absorbed it eagerly, pulsing with new warmth as it recognized the freely given sacrifice. Vaelen did the same, his ancient blood mixing with hers on the stone's surface. The moment their blood touched, the transformation began. Power unlike anything either had ever experienced flooded through them. Not the cold hunger of vampiric strength, but something warmer, the combined will of every woman who had ever chosen love over fear, sacrifice over safety. Elira felt her human limitations falling away as magical abilities awakened in her bloodline, gifts that had been dormant for generations suddenly blazing to life. But with the power came pain. The merger of their consciousness was like having their souls torn apart and rewoven together, intimate beyond anything physical, terrifying in its completeness. For a moment, Elira lost all sense of individual identity, becoming simply part of a greater whole that included not just Vaelen, but the essence of everyone who had ever contributed to this moment. The consuming dark struck again, sensing the critical nature of the transformation. Reality fractured around them as the entity threw everything it had at disrupting the binding. The chamber's walls dissolved, revealing the cosmic battlefield beyond, stars being born and dying in moments. Entire galaxies consumed and reborn as the forces of creation and destruction clashed on a scale that dwarfed mortal comprehension. Through it all, the binding circle held. Ancient magic, reinforced by centuries of sacrifice, created a bubble of stability in the chaos, allowing the transformation to continue despite the cosmic storm raging around them. Elira felt herself changing, not just gaining power, but becoming something new. Part human, part sorceress, part eternal guardian. Her senses expanded until she could perceive the mathematical structures underlying reality itself, could feel the flow of magic between dimensions, could touch the minds of allies fighting across the mountain. Vaelen's transformation was equally profound. His vampiric nature remained, but it was no longer a curse. It became the perfect complement to her magical abilities, strength and endurance that would allow him to stand guard for eternity without faltering. But even as they grew in power, the most crucial part of the ritual still lay ahead. The consuming dark wasn't just a force to be contained, it was a fundamental part of cosmic balance, hunger that ensured growth never became stagnation. To bind it permanently, they would need to become something equally fundamental, eternal love, standing as guardian against eternal hunger. The final words of the transformation hung in the air, waiting to be spoken. Once they were pronounced, there would be no going back, no chance to choose mortality, no possibility of simple human happiness. Only the responsibility of cosmic guardianship, carried out together for the rest of time. "Are you ready?" Vaelen asked, his voice echoing strangely in the expanded dimensions of their shared consciousness. "Yes," Elira replied, feeling the absolute certainty of her choice resonate through their bond. "Let's finish this." As they spoke the final words of transformation, something magnificent and terrible began to manifest above the heartstone. A phoenix feather, burning with white-hot fire that contained every color of creation, materialized in the air between them. The phoenix feather blazed with such intensity that it seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, its light reaching across realities to touch every soul that had ever chosen hope over despair. "The symbol of rebirth," Morgana's voice whispered in wonder. "I had hoped, but never dared to believe." The feather descended slowly, and as it touched the mingled blood on the heartstone's surface, the entire mountain shuddered with the force of cosmic change. This was no mere binding spell, this was the birth of something entirely new in the universe's long history. Elira felt the transformation reach its crescendo as the phoenix feather's power flowed through her. Every cell in her body rewrote itself. Every breath became a conscious choice to exist in service of protection rather than personal desire. She was still herself, but herself expanded beyond all previous limitations. Through their bond, she could feel Vaelen undergoing the same fundamental change, becoming not just vampire but guardian, protector, eternal sentinel. The consuming dark's assault intensified as it realized what was happening. This wasn't just another temporary containment, it was facing permanent imprisonment by being specifically evolved to counter its nature. Tendrils of pure negation lashed out desperately, trying to disrupt the transformation before it could be completed. But the phoenix feather's light proved stronger than cosmic darkness. Where the entity's attacks met the feather's radiance, something impossible occurred. The consuming dark's hunger was not destroyed, but transformed. The negative force that sought to devour existence became instead a positive force that strengthened the boundaries between realities, ensuring that what existed would be protected from threats beyond mortal comprehension. "It's working," Vaelen said, his voice filled with amazement as he watched the fundamental forces of the universe rebalancing themselves around their union. The dark isn't being destroyed, it's being redeemed. Through their enhanced perception, they could see the truth of cosmic balance revealing itself. Creation and destruction, love and hunger, hope and despair, all were necessary forces that kept existence stable. But when any one force grew too strong, it threatened to unravel everything. The consuming dark had become too powerful, too focused on pure negation. Now, through their willing sacrifice, it was being restored to its proper role in the cosmic order. The phoenix feather's fire spread outward from the heartstone, flowing through the binding circle and up through the castle's structure. As it touched the crystalline remains of the previous brides, something beautiful beyond description occurred. The women who had been trapped for centuries in conscious crystalline forms began to dissolve not into nothingness, but into pure light that joined the expanding wave of transformation. Their voices rose in a final chorus of joy as they felt their long imprisonment ending, not in death, but in absorption into something greater than any individual existence. They became part of the cosmic force that would ensure no reality ever again faced the threat of complete consumption. "Thank you," they whispered as one. "Thank you for choosing love over fear, hope over despair, transformation over destruction." The wave of phoenix fire continued to expand, reaching beyond the castle to touch every supernatural entity that had gathered for the final battle. Those who had served the darkness found their twisted nature healed, their hunger redirected toward protecting rather than consuming. Those who had fought for the light felt their strength renewed, their purpose clarified. In the valley below, the people of Thornwick woke from nightmares they couldn't remember to find their village bathed in gentle light. Children laughed in their sleep, and adults felt burdens they had carried for generations finally lifting from their shoulders. The eternal winter that had gripped their land began to break, and for the first time in centuries, the promise of spring touched the air. But the greatest transformation was occurring within Elira and Vaelen themselves. As the phoenix feather's fire completed its work, they found themselves standing not in the crumbling chamber where the ritual had begun, but in a space that existed between realities, a nexus point from which they could observe and protect countless worlds. They were no longer entirely physical beings, though they could take material form when needed. Instead, they had become something like living concepts, love standing eternal watch against hunger, hope maintaining the barriers that protected existence from the void beyond. "Are you afraid?" Elira asked, though she could feel his emotions as clearly as her own through their perfected bond. "No," Vaelen replied, his voice carrying centuries of wonder rather than the old weight of guilt and isolation. "For the first time since my transformation began, I am not afraid of what I am or what I might become." Around them, the rebalanced forces of the universe settled into new patterns. The consuming dark, no longer a threat but a necessary function, returned to its proper place in the cosmic order. The phoenix feather's light faded but did not disappear, becoming instead a permanent part of their merged essence. They were eternal now, guardians of the boundary between existence and void, protectors of every reality that had ever been or ever would be. But they were not alone in their vigil, they were together. Two souls who had chosen each other freely and completely, now bound by something stronger than magic, deeper than duty. Love made manifest, standing watch against the dark. 3 months after the night that changed everything, Thornwick experienced its first spring morning in over 300 years. Elira stood in what had once been the Garden of Memory, now restored to blooming magnificence, watching children play among flowers that sparkled with dewdrops in the warm sunlight. The sound of their laughter carried on a breeze that smelled of growing things and possibility. Around her wrist, where once her grandmother's pendant had hung, she now wore a simple silver band that pulsed gently with inner warmth. The unity ring had formed itself from the magical energy released when the curse finally broke, a symbol of the eternal bond she shared with Vaelen. Through it, she could feel his presence even when they were apart, could sense his contentment as he worked in the castle's great library, cataloguing centuries of supernatural knowledge for future guardians. "The roses are especially beautiful this year," came a familiar voice behind her. Elira turned to see Marta Whitfield approaching, moving with an ease that belied her advanced age. The healing that had swept through the valley hadn't reversed time, but it had lifted the weight of supernatural oppression that had aged everyone beyond their years. "They remember how to bloom again," Elira replied, touching a perfect white blossom that seemed to glow with its own light. "Sometimes I think the garden knows how much love went into its creation." Marta settled onto the stone bench that overlooked the terrace gardens, her eyes bright with the wisdom that comes from witnessing impossible things become beautifully real. "The whole village is different now. Oh, we look the same, go about our daily business much as we always have. But there's something in the air, hope perhaps, the sense that our lives matter for more than simple survival." It was true. In the month since the transformation, Thornwick had become something unprecedented, a village where the supernatural and mundane existed in harmony. Children who showed magical sensitivity were taught by Elira to use their gifts responsibly. Adults who had spent lifetimes fearing the darkness now worked alongside reformed supernatural entities to build something better than either had imagined possible. The castle on the mountain had become not a source of terror, but a beacon of protection. Travelers came from distant lands, drawn by stories of the place where ancient curses had been transformed into blessings, where love had literally changed the nature of reality itself. "Will you visit the village today?" Marta asked. Elira nodded. "The baker's daughter is getting married this afternoon. I promised to attend the ceremony." She smiled, remembering. "It seems fitting, somehow. I never got to see the last wedding dress I made, put to proper use. And Lord Vaelen? He'll be there as well." The villagers have finally stopped being afraid of him. Elira's expression grew thoughtful. It helped when they realized he was more nervous about attending a village celebration than they were about having him present. The transformation had changed them both in ways that continued to reveal themselves. Vaelen retained his vampiric strength and longevity, but the hunger that had once defined his existence was now directed toward protecting rather than consuming. He had become the guardian he was always meant to be, watching over not just Thornwick, but serving as a protector for supernatural refugees from across the dimensional boundaries. Elira had awakened to the full scope of her inherited magical abilities, but more importantly, she had discovered that her true gift lay in healing not just bodies, but souls, relationships, the fundamental tears in reality's fabric that allowed darkness to seep through. Together, they formed something that had never existed before, a partnership that strengthened both without diminishing either. As if summoned by her thoughts, Vaelen appeared on the garden path, moving with the fluid grace that had once seemed predatory, but now simply spoke of perfect physical control. He had learned to manifest in full daylight, not through any weakening of his vampiric nature, but through an evolution that made him as comfortable in light as he had once been in darkness. "The ceremony preparations are nearly complete," he said, joining them beside the rose bushes. "Though I believe the bride's mother is having what Thomas calls an attack of perfectionist nerves." "Some things never change," Marta observed with amusement. "Supernatural transformation or not, mothers will always worry about their children's wedding days." Vaelen's smile was warm and genuine, an expression that came easily to him now, as it should be. The ordinary joys deserve as much protection as the extraordinary ones. They walked together toward the village, 3 generations connected by shared experience of how much the world could change when people chose courage over comfort. Along the way, they passed the new memorial that had been erected in the village square, a crystal formation that held within it the preserved essence of every woman who had sacrificed herself to maintain the ancient protections. "They're not forgotten," Elira said softly, touching the memorial surface. "Their courage made everything we have now possible." "And they're free," Vaelen added, finally at peace, knowing their sacrifice achieved something lasting. The wedding that afternoon was everything a village celebration should be: joyful, chaotic, filled with laughter and tears, and the kind of love that makes ordinary moments feel magical. Elira and Vaelen participated, not as supernatural guardians, but simply as community members, sharing in the happiness of people they had chosen to protect. As evening approached and the celebration moved into its dancing phase, they slipped away to a hilltop overlooking the valley. Below them, Thornwick glowed with warm light, and the sound of music carried on the night air. Above them, stars shone with unusual brightness, as if the entire universe was celebrating the successful transformation of cosmic balance. "Any regrets?" Vaelen asked, his arm around her shoulders as they watched their adopted community settling into peaceful night. Elira considered the question seriously. They had given up any possibility of normal human lives, accepted responsibility that would last for eternity, bound themselves to duties that would sometimes require difficult choices and personal sacrifice. "None," she said finally, her hand finding the unity ring that connected them across all dimensions. "We chose love over fear, hope over despair, transformation over destruction. And look what grew from that choice." Around them, the night bloomed with possibilities, a future built on the foundation of willing sacrifice and mutual devotion, protected by guardians who had learned that the greatest strength came not from power, but from choosing to use that power in service of something greater than themselves. In the distance, spring thunder rumbled gently across the valley, promising rain for growing gardens and renewed life for all who dwelt under their protection.